Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in Conversations in the Future of Work. I am your host, Rachel Cossar, and I'm really excited to have a very special episode focusing on taking the leap, building your own community, writing a ton of content, and knowing when to go for it. And with us today is Justin Gordon. Justin, over to you, please. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Rachel. I appreciate it.
I'm just going to go ahead and say it. There's this crazy dog in my building that's just really having opinions. So you may hear him sharing some opinions in the background, but Justin, I'd love to hear just a little bit about, your bio. Tell us a bit about yourself.
For sure. I'm working on a few things. So always have my hands in many projects, but all kind of revolving around the same thing, which is content and community. And so right now, writing a newsletter called Just Go Grind, sharing stories of world-class founders, how they built their companies, and then building community as well with Village Lane. So it's a vetted community of startup founders, and then hosting a bunch of different free events through Just Go Grind in Los Angeles. And I have an event in SF. Like there's always different events kind of going on to bring people together, both from the founder perspective, but also investors and operators as well, because community is something kind of everyone craves. And I'm very focused on the in-person community side of things, and then using content on social media and in the newsletter to then find those people and then bring them together. And also on top of that, there's a little bit more with just being a scout at Headline, which is a venture fund based in SF, and also being a venture partner at Vitalize Venture Capital, because I do come across so many different founders always. So any early stage founders, always trying to have them basically direct them to different investors that may be helpful for them.
Awesome. It's like you're the community king. I love it.
Trying.
Great. So, I mean, I feel like many people probably would love to do something like what you're doing, and whether it's in the community content space or just launching their own business. And I'd love to know, when did you know or feel like it was time to take that leap and go off on your own?
Yeah, I've taken the leap a couple of different times. So it's always a matter of when I have something bubbling up that I can't stop thinking about, it ends up being the time that I want to take the leap. And so for this latest one, I quit my full-time job at Vitalize Venture Capital in May of 2023. At the time, the newsletter had grown to maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people. I was writing that full-time as well, basically on the side with Vitalize. So Vitalize was very full-time, but then I spent 20 to 30 hours researching and writing this newsletter every week. And I was like, this is probably not sustainable to do both. And so and I did it from February until May. And then I was like, I need to take the leap, because I think at that time I had the confidence that it was growing. I had booked my first sponsor, so revenue was coming in the door. And I was like, I think I can make this into an actual business. And so for me, I always maybe leap a little bit earlier than some, but having the validation of a sponsor and then also seeing the growth trajectory of the newsletter, and then knowing the fallback was, I have an MBA from USC. I know all these connections. It's less scary when you have a fallback as well. So I then took the leap in May of 2023 to go full time in all of this.
That's awesome. And can you tell us a little more about, the focus of Just Go Grind, and how has the focus changed and evolved? How do you come up with the direction for the content?
Yeah, it's been interesting. The content has evolved a lot. So in 2018 was actually when I started Just Go Grind as a blog, originally in January, with a career focus. And so anyone who wanted to switch careers was looking at what it would be like in different careers. Actually, I wanted to share more of those stories. So someone's a project manager or a product manager, what do they actually do day to day? I was curious about that. And then in June of 2018, I had launched this podcast that I wanted to kind of have those conversations with people to share those stories, and it evolved into founders specifically because I found those the most interesting of all, and then investors because I wanted to meet investors that would help founders. And then with the newsletter, the progression was I just wanted to start writing again. I hadn't written online as a blogging or newsletter content for myself in a long time. And so I just started writing. And then by February of 2023, I became obsessed with just these deep dive profiles, because I had heard about Sam Altman from the My First Million podcast. I knew who he was high level, but I didn't know the depth, what's his story, what's his background. And the content kind of just kept evolving where I wanted to write these deep dives. I found that to be the most fascinating thing, being what was their full story from early days to how they decided to start their companies and how they grow, how they progress, and just found those endlessly fascinating. So the content has always just evolved over time, year by year by year, and then always kind of fueled by what I'm most interested in, and then seeing what the reaction from people is as well.
Yeah, and I know what I've really appreciated about your deep dives is like the full picture of the person, right? I find as a founder myself, I'm constantly craving the like realness. I want like the real stories of like challenge and like how people really came out on the other end and were successful or were not successful. Like it's helpful to know that it's a tough journey for everyone.
Yeah, I found that too, actually. And like even so the deep dives and also the podcast interviews themselves. I've done over time 400 plus podcasts across multiple shows. And it's interesting because some of the podcasts I did from the earlier days, 2018, 2019, some of those founders, their companies failed or they quit and like they have a job now. But other ones are like they progressed and now they're running companies that are doing millions and millions in revenue and they've raised Series Bs and Series Cs and millions in more funding and like everyone has their own journey, but not everyone has succeeded from that. But they're still at it and still doing their own thing and figuring it out, which is it's more real, it's more human, which I always enjoy.
Totally, I totally agree. So, are there any similarities that you found between successful founders? And by successful, again, like it doesn't have to mean that the company itself ended up being like, a rocket ship, but yeah, just curious what comes up for you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the YC founder, like Paul Graham, always mentions like being relentlessly resourceful in founders, and that is undoubtedly something that comes up again and again. Both a mixture of like being high agency and relentlessly resourceful. That thread comes out through pretty much every founder because, especially with the newsletter, I'm only studying world-class founders, and that for the most part is they've started companies that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, and especially early days, but even as they grow, the resourcefulness they had just to get things off the ground, to find customers, to grow their team, the struggles that happened. I know one of them that sends out is like Ushma Garg from Gobble. She started that company. I think she sold it for like multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. And she went through 4 different iterations of her business model, even killing off business models that were working because it wasn't core to what she wanted to build in the end. And she had to be resourceful about figuring it out. She also got screwed over by investor who tried to pull their term sheet late and tried to lower her valuation by like 10x. She went through a lot, and the resourcefulness kind of needed to overcome that and just to continue pressing on, staying true to your vision. That combination of things is a thread that comes out through most of the founders, both being relentlessly resourceful, being kind of high agency, and then sticking with the vision that they had. And even though it may evolve over time, but sticking with it over time, like to stay true to what they want to build, that comes out again and again and again.
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually, Chris Savage, CEO and founder at Wistia, we had him on the show a few weeks ago, and he said something recently on LinkedIn that was in a similar vein. I think it was like early on in their journey, they were approached by like Hollywood and was it like Adam Sandler or something? Tom Hanks. And they were like, oh, we'd love to use your platform, your video platform for this very specific use case, which wasn't what they were doing at the time, but it would have been a huge contract. And they ultimately decided to decline because it wasn't in line with where they really wanted to be taking the company. And it was going to be a huge resource gobbler, and I think especially when you're young as a company, you have to make some pretty tough decisions in terms of where you're going to put your resources. And I think it would be so hard to have such a like revenue heavy opportunity come your way and then to decline that, like that takes a lot of courage,
Yeah.
I think.
What even going back to the Ushma one, and why it stands out is like they had, the goal was really more around kind of the direct to consumer model of like cooking and that experience of cooking in your own meals and having meal delivery kits that they eventually figured out. But the opportunity she turned down was like the enterprise catering model that was making a lot of money for them. But she's like, I didn't get into this business to do enterprise catering. Like that was not the goal. And so you have to think about that always and be like, what was I actually trying to build? I'm coming across that even now with like Village Lane stuff. I'm thinking about like this online pull of building an online community for founders. And there's plenty of online communities for founders. And right now there's people who have mentioned in like applications that they would pay for something online, but the core of what I want to build is in person. So staying true to that of like the in-person connection is why I want to build this. Then you're sticking with that vision. It's going to change a lot of different ways of how that plays out, but staying with that core, I'm reminded of that from all these different interviews and deep dives I've written around like what was the core of what you wanted to build in the first place and staying true to that over time.
Yeah, totally. That's I think something that as a founder you kind of keep want to wanting to come back to? Because it really is easy to get swept away
Yeah.
by a number of different pressures.
Everyone has an opinion, right? So for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your biggest learnings from either the first year or first few years of, being out on your own?
Yeah, there's so many different things that have happened. I think the ability to iterate and roll with things and experiment. Like I do experiments all the time for different things, and I'm lucky enough to have built an audience over the last few years. That's helpful because I can get more feedback faster. But everything's been iteration. Everything has been experiments. I'm kind of constantly testing different things, whether it be for like sales outreach and different messaging, or whether it be for what the content is itself on the newsletter. Obviously, there's different people I cover and that are deep dives, but even within that, like I've played around with like not just listening to podcasts and reading profiles and writing a deep dive from that. I've read full books. I've read like Disney's 800-page biography plus another book that was on him to write the Disney deep dive. Like that was an experiment. I was like, could I do this? Would it be overwhelming? It took like 2 weeks instead of 1 week. Like those types of things in the last year, I've always been testing, and you figure out what works over time. And also even now, like iterating with the business model as well as another experiment. Like I was doing mostly sponsorships for the newsletter the first, year-ish or so. And I was just like, not that I wouldn't do sponsorships moving forward, but I'm moving towards more of a membership model and moving towards a mixture of this kind of in-person component, which I wanted to be core to what I was doing, and then having the online component of the content. And so only from the last year figuring out this like testing and experimenting, that mindset has been super helpful in terms of like figuring all of this out. And then also the other thing, which has been a big learning, is being more public about what you're building. People are willing to help you out. And so I knew that kind of inherently before, and I had other projects I've done. I've seen that even with like growing Vitalize Angels, which is angel investing group at Vitalize, like knowing building that in public, we got buy-in from people from that, and founders found us for that, and other members found us. Same thing with Just Go Grind, and also even with Village Land. Like something that will come out soon, depending on when this is released, is I'm working on a retreat for Village Land, and a founder who sold his company for like $600 million found me through Twitter. We talked a couple of times. He's going to speak at this thing, and then also like just willing to help people. So I wouldn't have found them without being public about what I'm building, and then also asking for help, which a lot of founders struggle with. I don't struggle too much with it. I'm realizing how beneficial it is. So even with him, I was just asking for his feedback on stuff, and then he wanted to help more because I would just implement what he said. So
Right.
that's another lesson from this last like year. It's just like the asking for help side of things, the experimenting, all that's been helpful for me.
That's awesome. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how so much of that help and support has come from the online community, even though, the in-person community is what you're really looking to build out.
Yeah, and those deep relationships, though, I mean, a lot of things, especially now, just think about how work is operating now. Things that start online and then end up in person is like another depth. So, an example, again, for context, when we're recording this, yesterday I had a dinner with Headline, a venture firm, and I'm a scout for them, and they had brought all their scouts together. That started from them reaching out through LinkedIn because they had found the newsletter, had found value from the newsletter, knew I had this audience of founders. Then they were like, we're just starting the scout program. We'd love to have you be part of it. And then eventually, this is like months and months later, they're like, now we're doing a dinner for those scouts in LA. So like the online, the online to like in-person like funnel is very real if you kind of nurture that. And then it builds deeper relationships with all those people, because even there's a bunch of people from like Twitter that I've never seen in person that I saw in person the first time in this dinner. And now we're like following up, and now we're having calls. So like that's an interesting thing to see as well.
Totally. I've found that a lot. I mean, I think we both shared in a digital nomad experience at some point during the pandemic. And it was really fascinating to activate different cities and get to go to different places where you did have some of those online communities and connections and get to meet people in person while you were there. That was such a cool experience. And I would imagine that it's just going to continue to be like that.
I think people crave it. I mean, for sure. That's something a lot of people kind of have experimented with the digital nomad side of things. And I did that and went to your city. I went to Boston. I went to Minneapolis. I went to New York. I went all over during the digital nomad thing, and like Chicago, and just all more like Midwest and East Coast, because I'm on the West Coast. And I always reached out to people from like Twitter or from the news. Like I didn't have a newsletter at the time, but from Twitter that I wanted to meet up with in person. And it was tremendous. And then you go meet up in person. Then the next time you're engaging online, everyone's more engaged as well. Cause like I know them, I actually met them. It's a whole different level as well. Which is interesting to see how that kind of goes.
Totally. So switching gears a little bit and focusing or kind of, following that thread of this new world of work and all that, what trends have you seen either in different companies and startups that you've seen and are connected to that you think are net benefit when it comes to this new world of work?
Yeah, the thing obviously I'm very biased towards in person and figuring out what this looks like. But even like recently, I think I tweeted a poll and wanted to see where people were working from. And 73%, I think, was working from home. And then like 14% was, working from an office. Then people working from co-working spaces and coffee shops. I know that at Vitalize, we invested in Ground Floor, which is like a co-working space, but more of a community thing. People are craving community. And I talk about to a lot of founders, and that's for sure what they're craving. Even this morning, I talked to someone and they're interested in Village Lane. I was like, why? They were saying it's like mostly for the community piece of it and like the in-person connection. So in terms of future work, it's like, how do you build that with your employees? How do you build that with even your partners and stuff? I know a lot of VCs host events to get to know founders and other like service providers and everything. Same thing with you see companies like Brex doing Brex dinners and that. It's the same type of thing in work. Like people are trying to get together in person with people. It's to drive business, to drive connection between employees, between potential partners. I think that's going to only continue. And so coming out of the COVID, 2020, 2021, all of that, it seems like a bigger pull. And then because people are working kind of from home or working remote, they're trying to find more and more ways to combat that, and just in terms of like how they find connection and purpose and meaning. And so even a company like Marco Experiences, I think they're doing a bunch of like organizing retreats for companies, and they are crushing it. And I've looked at them for my own stuff, and I think that's gonna be interesting. So more like retreats and connection in this world of remote work, because you can't just be online forever. I think you need to see people, whether it be quarterly or annually or whatever it ends up being. So I think that trend will continue. The interesting piece though is then all this like real estate that was for offices that is now maybe empty or partially empty a lot more of the time. What does that become in work? And so I don't know if that becomes more community spaces. I think that could be part of it. That like a co-working-ish type of thing or some other use because of this trend in future work. That is like what I'm curious about, because I'm seeing that like these spaces as well are open. And I had someone I talked to who's in Vancouver, who they just reach out to offices that are open on weekends to do co-working stuff. And because they're empty and it's just like, what does that look like for work? Is there opportunities to do something there too? So there's a lot of different things in work about community and in person.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's what I'm always curious about is that level of intentionality in terms of how and when and why people gather, right? Because I do think that there's a lot to be said for having the flexibility of being able to work remotely and be taken seriously as a professional. But coming into an office, should be more than just coming into an office to be on video calls all day.
Yeah.
Right? We're seeing a lot of that with some of these kind of like the larger companies who are just like, yep, you're just back in the office. I have a colleague or a friend of mine who works at Fidelity, and they're required to come in like 1 or 2 weeks a month. She's the only one on her team who actually is in Boston. And so she's like, literally, she's like, I come into the office and then I sit in one of the silent phone booths because I actually like don't want to be disturbed. And then I connect over video with the rest of my team who are all over the country. And you're like, wow, like that, none of that makes sense.
No, that's not the office I think people want.
Oh my God.
Just solving that.
The other thing that I saw today, and I haven't done my own research into this, but I'm curious if you've heard something similar. It's not good. But apparently some companies are like calling people back into the office in a slightly more aggressive way, trying to get people to like trying to weed out people who want to just quit so they don't have to fire them. And then
Yeah,
they can save money on that.
I can see it, knowing how much severance can be, especially. Right? It makes a ton of sense. But it's going to be interesting, this revolt, right, of like what happens then from employees. And they're just going to change companies. It's just like pretty clear. And like it also think of like from a talent perspective, like your top talent, what helps them stay and what helps them stay happy and what helps them do their best work and all of those things. I just finished writing a deep dive on founder of Patagonia and them having like a childcare facility early on for like one of the first corporate childcare facilities and having all these things that like, it's obviously a very mission driven company, but even besides that, it's like to the core, they're helping their employees and everyone else. And that obviously makes people stay, and their employee wellness is like some of the best places to work. So if you're going to stand out as a company, how are you thinking about that for your employees? And given the work environment where it is maybe flexible and remote, it's also one of those things where it's like, you do have to stick to your guns though. If you want to build an in-person culture, cool, but you have to, especially if you're going to like restart that and you don't already have that, you're going to lose out on a lot of people, but then you will attract people who want that, which is fine. It's just like, can you survive through that turnover if you haven't already switched over? Or if you're starting from scratch today, knowing what kind of culture you're trying to build is important. Are you trying to build in person? Are you going to be remote? Like I think about Beehive, company that's crushed it. They're like remote from the beginning, but you have other companies who are doing like, obviously if it's more deep tech and like in person is going to be the thing, it makes sense. That's what you're building. So companies have to think about that as well.
Totally. Yeah. The more intentional, I think, the better. And being able to design something that might be flexible so that you can meet multiple needs at the same time. But no one size fits all answer. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. Where can people find you, connect with you, follow your work?
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter probably. So Justin Gordon 212 on Twitter. Otherwise, justgogrind.com is where I have more of the event stuff and also the newsletter. And then villagelane.io is where I'm doing this vetted community for founders.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much. And as always, thanks to our audience for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you.